Welcome to Massey College, and welcome to the 7th season of the Massey Dialogue. I want to, my name is Nathalie Desrosiers, and I'm the principal of Massey College. And I'm really happy to welcome you for this 7th season of intergenerational, interdisciplinary, and inclusive dialogues that we hold at Massey College. I want to acknowledge that Massey College is built on indigenous lands, the lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and it is the treaty land of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We want to acknowledge our duty of stewardship toward the land and the great privilege that we have to be in a partnership with the Mississaugas of the Credit here at Massey. So I want to thank Michael Valpy, who's going to be our moderator, and invite all of us to continue to engage in the spirit of discussion with respect. And I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much, Michael, for doing this.
Good. Okay. So just so I've got the technical stuff right, Joe, are you can, I'm coming through. Okay. Well, as Principal Desrosiers said, my name is Michael Valpy. I'm a senior fellow here, and I am a senior fellow here and a senior fellow in public policy at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. I was for many years a journalist, a foreign correspondent, and a political columnist with the Globe and Mail. And I teach media ethics in the Book and Media Studies program at the University of St. Michael's College. And my students joke whenever they hear that I teach media ethics, they say, "Ha ha, professor, it's a short course." I'm glad there's a laugh there somewhere. And I am really pleased to introduce the panelists and our guest. I think you're going to get an outstanding look at what is happening. And to introduce the three panelists, let me start with Anne-Marie Fowler, who is at the end of the row. She's a Ph.D. candidate in the Department of the Study of Religion.
You have the intro is on the other page.
I've got it, the wrong one.
Thank you.
Fine, thank you.
Sure, no problem.
She's a Ph.D. candidate in the Department for the Study of Religion at the University of Toronto in collaboration with the Tanenbaum Center for Jewish Studies. She is a graduate affiliate of the Schwartz-Reisman Institute for Technology and Society, a recent fellow at the Center for Ethics, and not last but not least, a junior fellow at Massey College. She is returning to academia following a few decades of work in finance, politics, and project management in New York, Washington, and San Francisco. And Anne-Marie's research levers potential applications of Jewish concepts of temporality with artificial systems knowledge of construction. Tell me what that means.
Basically, it's pulling Jewish concepts of time and seeing how they could apply to artificial systems learning. It's about AI and about how AI understands time. And it's a new concept. AI knows a lot about the past, but the AI doesn't often consider the future.
The world will be really happy when you get your doctorate for studying this. Beside Anne-Marie is Lior Pollak. Lior currently works for a leading Israeli law firm, Horowitz Co, in corporate litigation with a focus on large-scale infrastructure and energy projects. Prior to moving into law, Lior spent 2.5 years in military service with the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, with the IDF's elite intelligence unit, 8200. What's 8200 stand for?
It's a good question.
Are you allowed to tell us?
Not that there's a particular meaning, it doesn't really matter, but unfortunately no.
Okay. She then worked for a variety of not-for-profits, which foster social justice at a national level. She contributed to producing applied social research, which continues to drive and inform better legislation and policy in Israel. She completed her Bachelor's of Law via Tel Aviv University and the University of Toronto, following a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology and International Relations from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Excuse me, and during her studies, Lior was active in local grassroots movements aimed at strengthening the fabric of Israeli society through the diverse populations. Lior is an advocate for regional peace initiatives since the age of 14, when she participated in the Seeds of Peace program for Israeli and Palestinian youth, and hopes to continue pursuing this path in her future career and civic involvement. And then our third panelist is Khalil Al-Wazir, who's an alumnus of King's College London. Khalil was author of Centrist Reflections on Political Philosophy. He's deeply involved in research as a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Toronto with the Post-Core Lab, and currently hosts the Diplomatic Discord podcast, bridging information asymmetries between academia and diplomatic practice. And I will define that for you because I had to get Khalil to define it for me. The Post-Core Lab is the post-conflict reconciliation laboratory at UofT. The research focuses on armed groups and armed conflict, multilateral interventions, security sector reform, and disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. The Diplomatic Discord podcast is intended to share my research in a more accessible format. He writes to me, it's a pet project of mine. I've already posted an episode on the causes of civil wars and one on classical realist theory in international relations theory. Prior to joining this program, Khalil contributed to 2 United Nations Secretary General reports and played a prominent role in a system-wide review of security sector reforms. He was awarded the United Nations Department of Safety and Security's Undersecretary General's Excellent Award. As a Palestinian, Khalil aspires toward a career that promotes peace and prosperity in the Middle East. And finally, that brings us to our guest.
Make this one short, Michael.
It's pretty short. I don't have to.
Okay.
Why, am I going on too long?
Well, I think we should get on to the substance.
All right. So I won't say that you're born in Winnipeg. You have a law degree from the University of Western Ontario in 1976, a Master's of International Law from the University of London School of Economics in 1977. He joined the then Department of External Affairs in 1981. In addition to postings abroad in Mexico City and New Delhi, Jon held the positions of Minister for Political Affairs in the Canadian Embassy in Washington from 2004 to 2006, and Assistant Deputy Minister for the Americas in 2010 to 2012. From 2006 to 2010, he was Canada's ambassador to Israel, and from 2012 to 2016, he was ambassador to Spain. He's currently a senior fellow excuse me, at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto, and the chair of Project Rosanna Canada, which is a not-for-profit whose objective is to build bridges between Palestinian and Israelis via the health sector. And I want to start by asking you, and we're now there at the question time. I want to start by asking you, where are we going? And what hope is there for a rapid resolution, or if not particularly rapid, can you look ahead into the future and see that there is a possibility for this ending with a resolution that's not bloody?
Okay, thank you, Michael, and thank you to all my panelists, and thank you to all of you for being here. Let me start by being transparent. I'm feeling a little rough for Khalil here because he's definitely in the minority. I am Jewish. My wife is a Holocaust survivor. My sister lives in Israel on a kibbutz. I have been an advocate of the two-state solution, the end of settlements, the end of the occupation, since long before I became the ambassador there. And I'm the chair of Project Rosanna, as Michael said, which is doing everything we can to bring Palestinians and Israelis together via the health sector. So we train Palestinian doctors, nurses, and therapists. We transport Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza to their hospital appointments, and we treat Palestinians in the West Bank and in hospitals in Israel. Michael, you've asked me the $64,000 question. Well, I guess these days it's the $64 billion question.
Yeah.
So I'm going to just jump right to what can be done, what we should be hoping for. We can talk about the proximate causes of the current attacks. We can talk about the root causes of the current attacks. But where can we go from here? Where we have to go from here is back to Oslo and back to the two-state solution. There is no other solution for the Middle East right now. I have very good friends who say two-state solution is dead, it's only a one-state reality, and get on with it and figure out how to get there. I don't believe that, and we can certainly talk about why I don't believe it. Now, how do we get to the two-state solution? Well, we get there, first of all, by ending this conflict with as little humanitarian disaster as we can. It's already a disaster. It's catastrophic for Palestinians. It was catastrophic and is catastrophic for Israelis too. So let's leave that aside and we can talk about it. But where we have to go is to build up a Palestinian governance, one that is ready and capable to sit down with Israelis. We have to get rid of the current government in Israel as soon as possible, a government that for 15 years has opposed the two-state solution and has done everything possible to avoid it. We have to end the settlements, any settlement expansion immediately. We have to get rid of the illegal outposts as soon as is possible. The major settlements will stay where they are, and there will hopefully be a swap. The 5 or 6 final status issues that were discussed at Oslo, that were discussed between Barak and Abbas, between Arafat and others, are not that difficult. They are doable. There are 2 hard ones. One's Jerusalem. One is refugees and how many are going to come back and how many will go to the state of Palestine. These are doable. I'll just say that the Protestants and the Catholics fought for 400 years and nobody thought that they were going to be able to solve their problem. And they did. In South Africa, apartheid was entrenched. And I talked to a South African journalist who came to Israel for fear of his life, who told me that he thought that apartheid was going to last another 50 years. And then one day it was over. I was in the Department of External Affairs in 1989 when our ambassador from Moscow came to talk about the situation. He did not have a clue that the wall was going to fall in 1989, and either did anybody in the State Department or frankly in Moscow. The Israelis and the Palestinians have a tendency to think that their problem is insoluble. It's not insoluble. It takes leadership, new leadership. It takes compromise. It takes realizing that the dangers of continuing on this path for both sides, but I'm speaking mostly of the Israelis because they are the asymmetric, larger power. The danger of continuing on this path is only going to lead to more violence, not only in Gaza, but it's going to be in the West Bank, and it's going to be in Jerusalem, and if they're not careful, it's going to be in Israel proper. This cannot continue, and going forward, there are two options. We can have what happened after the Yom Kippur War, where 3 years after the war, 2 years after the war, Sadat was speaking in the Knesset, and 3 years after, there was peace between the Israelis and the Egyptians. So we can have an Israeli population, after it gets over the absolute agony that they are in, and a Palestinian population who can, at a certain point, begin to forgive, because it'll be better if they can move on. We can have people moving in that direction, in the direction of peace, in the direction of a reality that there is a better place, or we can have Israel moving to the right and Palestinians moving to terror. And I am hopeful that we're going to move in the right direction. I'm not sure of it, but I'm hopeful that that will happen.
If you gave this talk you just gave in Israel to an Israeli audience, what would the reaction be?
Right now, the reaction would be very negative. I am in a group of pro-peace, anti-occupation, anti-settlement individuals, and I was on the phone with them 3 days ago, and they are totally in support of what the Israeli government is doing. Now, why is that? And you know, it's not root causes. I'm not talking about the thousands of Palestinians that have already lost their lives. I'm just telling you what's going on in Israel. On July 7th, when people woke up in the morning before they heard about October 7th, before they heard about this, they had confidence that the IDF was their protector. They had confidence that even if they didn't like their current prime minister, that they had a state that functioned and that they were more or less protected in their borders. After October 7th, all of that is gone for them. I'm saying literally, they no longer feel that the contract with their state is valid. They no longer feel that either their intelligence or their agencies or their IDF is there to protect them, and they are totally freaked out. And for these peaceniks who I was about to bring 3 of them and a Palestinian, a former minister in the PA, to Canada to talk about ending the occupation. For these people to tell me that they supported what was going on, getting rid of the political and the military leadership in Hamas, shocked me. And then 5 minutes after they said that, the sirens went off and they headed into their bunkers, which just gave me a bit of pause about telling them that I thought they were wrong and that achieving their goals were, if not incredibly difficult, probably impossible, and talking about radicalization of the population and things getting potentially worse. But they were down with their grandchildren. Unfortunately, the Palestinians have nowhere to go. They have no bunkers to hide in. They have no safe spaces. Even those that have, the 650,000 that have moved to the south. So it's a pretty awful situation on both sides of the border.
Thank you. Okay, let me tell you just what the plan is as to how the rest of the evening is going to work. Our three panelists will each have approximately 15 minutes apiece with Jon. If whoever doesn't have the floor suddenly comes up with a burning question for Jon, please intervene and ask it. Okay? So that would take us about 3 people, 15 minutes each, 45 minutes. And then I'm going to turn it over to you for a question and answer with Jon. And I hope that all that will work well. So, Anne-Marie,
Okay.
go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I am just very excited to be on this very distinguished panel. So I've met some very wonderful people in our planning process for this event. So I am the American on the panel. I'm going to ask a question about Joe Biden. I'd like to know, how do President Biden's recent and I'll add unequivocal statements delivered from Israel and from the Oval Office influence Canada's voice? What might Canada be able to say right now that President Biden cannot say?
So obviously Joe Biden arrived in Israel. We saw the bear hug when he got off the plane. We heard his speech. For Joe Biden, the Israel thing is both personal, as many of you would have heard in his speech, and it's political. I don't know whether he realized it or his staff realized it, but not long after he gave his full-throated support for Israel, which he felt and which both Democrats and especially Republicans feel. So that's the political side. He began to realize that one had to start talking about the humanitarian situation. And one had to start talking about the hostages. And he's obviously moved now to the point of calling for a humanitarian pause and a humanitarian corridor. And he's clearly putting pressure on the Israelis to deliver more aid faster, etc. There's also a suggestion that he's slowed down the ground invasion because he is concerned about attacks against American bases, embassies, etc. And whether that's true or not, it's not clear. But certainly the ground invasion has been slowed, and there are multiple reasons why that. So as to Canada, actually, Canada and the Americans are not that different. Canada came out full-throated support of Israel's right to self-defense. It also very quickly moved to the humanitarian issues. We have hostages there, dual nationals, as do the Americans and many others, so that became obviously an important concern. And I think the Americans and the Canadians and the Brits, I think the West in general, they're all on the same page.
Right.
I would only say that I don't think the global south and I don't think the street in the Middle East is on that page by any stretch of the imagination. But we can come back to that.
Okay. So a follow-on question. Bibi Netanyahu has certainly endeavored to make some changes to the judiciary, changes to the reasonableness doctrine, to the power of the courts to be able to question what a unicameral legislature and what a very powerful government can do or decide or whom they can appoint. Certainly, Biden's visit to Israel has garnered major attention and also major gratitude for the very immediate and, again, unequivocal support that he's brought. But Biden also brings a very, very staunch commitment to democracy and also brings some opposition to what Netanyahu was endeavoring over the summer and again, just up until very recently. What happens to the efforts to reduce or eliminate the reasonableness doctrine, the reasonableness test at this point? And what do you think happens to Netanyahu's efforts to change Israeli democracy within the current situation as it's developed?
Sure. When Michael and I first talked about doing this lecture, it was going to be about Bibi's efforts to
Yes.
radically reform Israel. Basically, in many ways, do away with its democratic norms and values. It wasn't only going to strip the Supreme Court of its ultimate decision-making powers. It was going to try and pass a legislation that would give the Knesset, with a one-vote majority, the power to override any decisions by the Supreme Court. It was going to control the appointments to the Supreme Court. But it was going to do much, much more. It was going to declare that Palestinians who committed terrorist acts within Israel could be subject to the death penalty. And Palestinians who were declared disloyal could be expelled. It gave billions of shekels to the Orthodox sector while stripping money from public education. And of course, it had a government that was not only expanding settlements at a faster rate than they had ever expanded, but that had actually advocated annexation with two racist ministers in his cabinet. So what's going to happen? Well, first of all, although Bibi Netanyahu is the only senior person who has yet to apologize for what happened on October 7th, I think there is a consensus in Israel that he will be gone as soon as the war is over and the protests hit the streets. Mm-hmm. You know, there were 39 weeks of protests against his reforms, his legislative reforms. Well, now the protests will be much larger. There is a massive consensus that he, in many ways, is responsible for this war. Responsible because military units were moved from Gaza to the West Bank. Why? Because the policies of his ministers to expand settlements and to talk about annexation created violence in the West Bank. 100 Palestinians were killed, 30 Israelis were killed. So units were moved there. Why? Because he was negotiating a deal with the US and Saudi Arabia, which basically lip service was going to be paid to the Palestinians. The same lip service that was paid when the Abraham Accords were signed. So you were going to have this great deal, and Bibi was already crowing about the fact that I can get a deal with Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Gulf without even dealing with the Palestinians. And many people think that was one of the reasons that Hamas did what it did on the day that it did, 1 day and 50 years after the Yom Kippur War. So there is, and the fact that Bibi for years, we're talking years, has allowed money to flow from Qatar. We're talking $1 billion over 10 years, money to flow from Qatar to Gaza, to Hamas. Why? Because he wanted to be able to say, we don't have a partner. As long as Hamas was just firing rockets from time to time, and the poor people in Sderot and some of the kibbutzim were getting hit, that could be controlled. We're going to mow the lawn, we're going to go in there, we're going to control it. But we're going to keep Hamas financed, and then I can tell the world, bunch of terrorists running the Gaza Strip, PA corrupt, old, no elections, so no two-state solution. Well, guess what? It came back to bite them. Now, Israelis, if they didn't know about this, they all know about it now because it's being published every day in the papers. So when this is over, you know, I hope, Israelis hope that Bibi will be gone. The question is, who's going to replace him?
Right.
I think Lior knows that constitutionally it's not so easy. You know, in Canada, you just have a vote, and an opposition vote, and you can, as long as you got enough votes in Parliament, you can get rid of a party or a prime minister. It's not as easy in Israel. But we'll see what happens. Again, this goes back to your question, Michael, do we move farther right and somebody else from Likud takes over? Or do we realize that we need a center coalition that has the interests of the country as opposed to the prime minister's own interests at heart?
Okay. One more question about democracy. This one's about Ukraine. Some attention has certainly shifted away from the war in Ukraine since October the 7th. So do you have thoughts on how Russia and Ukraine may each be affected by this shift in global attention away from that conflict?
Right. So originally you had some Biden stuff in there, so I'll address the Biden stuff.
Yes, please do.
So you'll recall that Biden is now asking for $110 billion from Congress, and now that the Republicans have a speaker, that might begin to be discussed. He's only actually asking for $10 billion for Israel.
I think it's 14. But yeah.
14?
Yes.
And he's asking for much, much more for Ukraine and much, much more for Taiwan. And he's done this because he knows that the Republicans will support Israel unequivocally, but they're a bit iffy on Ukraine, and he's hoping that by tying, and they're also anti-China, so he's hoping that by tying the three together, he can get this through. And we'll see what happens. But on the Ukraine-Russia thing, of course, the Russians and the Chinese are ecstatic about what's going on. The Americans are now tied up in the Middle East. We talked about this before. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, 2 weeks before October 7th said that the Middle East has never been so quiet. Well, it's not so quiet. So the Americans are tied up, and the Russians and the Chinese are happy. Bibi is very unhappy because he had a special relationship with Putin. Putin would allow him to fly his jets into Syria and bomb Syria whenever Hezbollah was transferring arms there. And Putin would look the other way. And Putin was slowly allowing Jews from Russia to emigrate into Israel.
Right.
And when people like me and others in Israel were aghast that Israel didn't stand up for the Ukraine, those were his excuses. That's why I can't stand up for Ukraine. I've got this relationship with the Russians. Well, the Russians have now come out 100% in favor of the Palestinians, in favor of the cause, and against Israel. Why? Because they are currently getting drones and other weapons from Iran. And who are Iran's partners? Hezbollah and Hamas. So Bibi's not happy, the Russians are happy, the Ukrainians are happy. This is unfortunately taken the world's attention away from Ukraine to the extent that it was on Ukraine. And I'm sure that the leadership in Ukraine is not happy about this. But in the end, they may get the money out of Congress that they might not have, because the Israelis are fighting the Palestinians, as bizarre and awful as that is.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. Yeah, I just did want to note that the tying together of Ukraine and Israel in Biden's address recently was very much politically motivated, but I think also very clever under the circumstances. And those are my questions, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Lior, you're on.
Yes. I'd like to preface by saying that, similar to Jon, my family also, I'm a granddaughter of Holocaust survivors. And so the events of October 7 are extremely devastating to us and should be condemned unequivocally. I'd also like to say that for myself and for Khalil, this is not merely a theoretical or academic discussion. Our families are there. This is reality for us, even though we're currently sitting here in Canada. So this is not an easy conversation to have. But nonetheless, I think we both aspire for the same path forward. So I'd like to emphasize that before anything else. Jon, I think you touched a little bit on some of the issues I would like to address, so you can maybe just expand on those. Myself being a participant in the protest movement for the last 10 months, we've seen civil infrastructures basically being built for that purpose. And once everything started, they were almost automatically redirected to address the situation, leaving everything related to the judicial overhaul behind. I think there is a real issue and question concerning the Israeli public's ability to leverage that movement and those tools to make a political change. How potentially could that be done in the post-war future?
Thanks. So this political movement that Lior's talking about was behind the 39 weeks of protest. And there was always a question of how these people who had been able to bring Israelis together in a way that they had not been together for a long time. 65% of Israelis were opposed to the reforms, and they were out there, you know, a lot more people than were protesting in Hungary or Poland or a number of other countries where democratic values and democratic principles were under threat. In fact, the percentage of Israelis that were on the street was actually quite incredible. Like we're talking the equivalent of 20 million Americans in proportional terms. So there was a question of how are they going to transform themselves into some political movement. As some of you may know, the left was considered to be almost dead in Israel. They did terribly in the last election, and so who of these protesters was going to somehow turn political? That's still a question, although I may be wrong, but I think the desire to move forward with these radical reforms, even when the war is over, it's probably gone. I don't think they will have the energy or the chutzpah to try and do that now. I think what will happen is that these protesters will transform themselves into protesting to get rid of Bibi and to move as fast as possible to elections. I should say, though, that despite the fact that they were out for 39 weeks arguing for democracy in Israel, they were not arguing, for the most part, for the end of the occupation, and they were not arguing, for the most part, for full equality between Israeli Arabs and Jewish Israelis. And I understand why they had taken the position that they had united disparate parts of Israel, and if they brought in those issues, then clearly parts of the protest would split off because there would be disagreements about the occupation or the two-state solution, et cetera, et cetera. But towards the end, there were more and more signs and more realization that you can't argue for democracy in Israel and have a nation-state law that basically creates two kinds of citizens. Now, Arab Israelis have a lot of rights. In my view, there is not apartheid in Israel proper. There is apartheid in the West Bank. There is not apartheid in Israel proper, but there is discrimination. There is a lack of funding for education, for housing, et cetera, et cetera. So, we'll see what happens. The protests will come back, but they will be anti-Bibi protests. And I think that's going to be the focus. Politics. How do we get to elections? Where does Israel go from there? Yeah.
Thank you. From an international perspective, and you touched on that a little bit before, we've seen a strategy of trying to create regional arrangements and agreements, and they have showed measured success, at least concerning the fact that Israel is surrounded by military terrorist organizations from various locations. However, these regional agreements, as you said before, didn't really focus on benefiting Palestinians as well. And essentially, that didn't bring forward any focus to Palestinian issues and what Israel is going to do about that. How do you think the current war and crisis is going to affect this strategy?
Well, let me just say, I can be very critical of Israel, but your point about who surrounds them is completely true. I mean, they are surrounded by Hamas, which in its constitution calls for the destruction of Israel and the elimination of all Jews. To the north is Hezbollah, which has the largest army in the countries of Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, which also calls for its destruction. And they are backed by Iran, which also calls for its destruction. So Israel is living in a very dangerous neighborhood. Now, they thought they had things more or less under control, and that hubris has now been shattered, but that is a reality, and we can't forget it. So making peace with the Gulf was a massive advancement for Israel, getting recognition by countries who had basically all called for its destruction and had gone to war with Israel in 48 and supported the war in 67 and supported the war in 73, etc. So this was great. But just stepping back, the original deal, it was called the Saudi Initiative, was the Saudis said, we all will recognize you, Israel, as soon as you make peace with the Palestinians. When there's a Palestinian state, you've got us all. Well, then Donald Trump entered the picture, and Jared Kushner and Bibi Netanyahu, and they negotiated with the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco, and they gave everybody, the Americans gave everybody a little piece of this and a piece of that, recognition of the Western Sahara, and taking the Sudanese off the terrorist list, and giving lots of Israeli intelligence to the UAE, and so they got this deal. But the deal was supposed to benefit the Palestinians. What it actually said was that Bibi couldn't go ahead with annexation, which was on the table at the time. So annexation didn't go forward, but Donald Trump didn't even want annexation, so it probably wasn't going forward anyway. But really, nothing came for the Palestinians. What came for the Palestinians was, in May of 2021, activities on Al-Aqsa, which led to intercommunal violence, and frankly, the UAE and others didn't do anything. So the Palestinians didn't get anything out of that. My take is they weren't going to get very much out of the deal with the Saudi Arabia either. But going to your point, that deal is off the table. Whether it's off the table forever or whether it's just off the table until things quiet down and the Saudis feel that despite their streak, they can try and bring it back, because the Saudis were allegedly going to get civil nuclear cooperation with the Americans, they were going to get weapons from the Americans, and they were going to get a lot of intelligence sharing from the Israelis as well. So it's off the table. Aaron David Miller said today that it's not in, it's gone. Somebody else said it was in the deep freeze and it might come back. We'll see what happens going forward.
Okay. So from this point, also looking towards the future, in a theoretical post-war scenario at the moment, and knowing that both Israelis and Palestinians have a duty to work towards each other to find a solution, which tools do you think Israel could use in promoting better leadership, both within itself, as you've said before, with which I agree, but also for Palestinians, assume that they also are suffering under the current regime in Gaza? Would strengthening the Palestinian Authority, as opposed to what Netanyahu has been doing for the last 15 years, be enough, or?
Well, first of all, they have to stop the settlements, expansion. I mean, that would be the clearest signal on the part of Israelis that they are serious about wanting to create a political horizon. So stop the settlements, and then try and build up the Palestinian Authority, yes. All of the discussion about post-Gaza conflict envisions an interim authority coming in, perhaps backed by the Gulf states, with the UN and maybe others, to take over Gaza, and the PA could not enter Gaza on the back of the guns of the Israelis, so that won't happen, certainly for the near or perhaps medium term. But as you say, the Israelis then have to build up the PA, which has little credibility in the West Bank and not much more credibility in Gaza. Ironically, Hamas has little credibility in Gaza, and the PA has little credibility in the West Bank. So that's an unfortunate reality. There have been no elections in the West Bank for 15 years. There's been no elections in Gaza since 2005. So yes, you've got to actually, you can't build up Mahmoud Abbas at this point, who's the current leader of the PA and is 86 or 87 years old. You've got to build up civil society. You've got to move towards elections. You've got to let the young entrepreneurs and young people of the West Bank who are ready to provide, I think, some decent governance, bloom and hopefully create an environment when elections can be held. And but all the while, you've got to send signals that if you guys get your act together, we are prepared to deal with you, as opposed to, there is no partner, and we're going to denigrate the PA even though they're helping to protect us by controlling Palestinian terrorism in the West Bank. So it's not going to happen overnight, but everybody, the Western world is finally, once again, talking about the two-state solution. Joe Biden and Melanie Joly are actually talking about the two-state solution again. So to go back to your question, Michael, people are, the horrible result of this might well be that the West may begin to push Israel to do something. Put the screws to Israel if settlement expansion continues, et cetera, et cetera. As previous presidents did. Bush 41 with Jim Baker did it. Other presidents have put pressure on Israel to try and move some of these issues forward. And the Palestinians have to get their act together. And they've got a pretty corrupt leadership that has no credibility amongst young people. So it's a tough slog, but
Thank you.
good luck.
Yeah.
Well, I have to say,
Khalil, just before you go, start talking, you'll notice that on your chairs were cue card. Yeah, exactly. If you would like to write your questions down, and Alyssa will figure out some way of picking them up and bringing them up to me, and so that I will have them when question time comes. Khalil, go ahead.
well, I have to say this has been a remarkably refreshing conversation so far, compared to what you see in the media today, and the vitriol and the rhetoric and the dehumanization that's ongoing. This is immensely important. And your emphasis on tackling the root causes of the problem, recognizing that what happened today, this conflict that happened and erupted today, this war, this brutality, this senseless massacre that's happening in Gaza now, did not begin and did not start from a vacuum. It became and began because there has been a long and brutal military occupation, the longest in human history so far. And it's because of the 100 years of dispossession of the Palestinian people and 56 years of military occupation. It's because of the constant sprawling settlement expansion. And you're right to point out that, as I see it, there has been no single individual more responsible for killing the two-state solution, more even than Hamas, than Netanyahu himself. If you recall, he was one of the people who inflamed the Israeli society against who at the time was a peacemaker of Ishaq Rabin, that is. And a far-right Israeli settler fanatic assassinated him at the time. Now, and Ishaq Rabin is also an interesting figure in this regard, because he himself was a war criminal before this. He had a lot of blood on his hands. He was one of the people responsible for the ethnic cleansing of Al-Ramla in 1948, of which my grandfather was a victim. And a signature was enough to wash away the blood then. Even then, he managed to push beyond it and ask for peace. And Netanyahu was one of the people who contributed to derailing the two-state solution in that regard. And if you look at the conflict today, you cannot ignore what's been happening. You have 7,000 Palestinians dead already, 3,000 of them children, 1,500 of them women. This is not a war, this is a massacre. And if you look at the war plans that the Israelis have already implemented, why did I mention Rabin? I mentioned him because if you look at the war plans of what the Israelis are doing in Gaza, they have, in 48 hours, requested for 1.1 million Palestinians to evacuate the north of the Gaza Strip to go to the south. And immediately that resonated with what happened in 1948, with the ethnic cleansing campaigns that occurred then. And this is one of the problems with standing by Israel at this moment. You have a fanatic Israeli government. Sure, the war cabinet has included some more moderate figures according to the Israeli political spectrum. But you have fanatics in this government, like Ben-Gvir, like Smotrich, who are actively inflaming tensions, who are arming settlers and pushing them to commit rampages in the West Bank, which could lead to an outburst of violence, an intifada in the West Bank as well. All of this is happening, and in the Palestinian consciousness, this is seeming like an ethnic cleansing. And if the context of this conflict continues to escalate, if this war continues to go on, then things could get even more violent. The fact that they still have not even begun the ground invasion, and this is the number of deaths, the destruction that we have seen, should be a cause for concern for many. And if you look at the trend, I believe we have to tackle the root causes of this problem. We have to eliminate the occupation. We have to push for a two-state solution. And I hope that this violence will show the world, yet again, that you cannot ignore the Palestinian cause. For too long, the Americans have thought that this could be contained. Maybe it's because of overconfidence in the excessive surveillance network that the Israelis have put in the West Bank. Maybe it's because of an over-reliance on the modern technologies and the most brutal surveillance system that has happened. And by the way, this could happen here in Canada if you're not careful, because these technologies are tested on us first before they're sold to you here. Now, this is partly the major reason behind it. The Americans have thought that they could ignore the Palestinian question, that you could unilaterally move the embassy to Jerusalem and there would be no violence. They thought that they could have peace with all of the other Arab governments in the region and there would be no violence. They thought that they could ignore the Palestinian question, and this shows more than ever before that you cannot have peace in the region. There will never be stability in the region without resolving the Palestinian question, without fulfilling the Palestinian right to self-determination on 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital, with the right of return of Palestinian refugees, as has been recognized by international law in UN Security Council Resolution 2334. Now, the reason it's important to talk about this today is because you mentioned the need to stop the settlements, and you mentioned the power asymmetry between the two. If we're going to move towards a future of peace, we have to recognize the failures of past peace processes. What led to that failure? And the power asymmetry that you pointed on is one of the major causes of that power asymmetry. There has to be a neutral broker. And the United States has monopolized the Palestinian peace process, Palestine-Israeli peace process, for far too long, while they were not playing the role of an honest broker, partly due to domestic constraints. I hope that this would be the case. Now, with this, stopping the settlements won't come from nothing, as I see it. It will not come unless the world stands up and says, this is unacceptable. You have to put sanctions on far-right Israeli ministers. You have to put sanctions on the settlement expansion. This is the only way that it can happen. This is the only way that apartheid in South Africa was removed and dismantled. I have hope that this can happen, and you're right to say that it might happen at any moment, because now there is a recognition in the world that there is a need for peace and that there is a need for change, and that you cannot continue with the status quo as it existed before. And hopefully we will move in this direction. And my question to you, Jon, is what can Canada do to take an independent stance from that of the United States? How can Canada contribute towards renewing momentum towards a two-state solution, to a just and lasting resolution of this conflict, instead of blindly following the United States in what is the guise of a war, but in reality will very predictably be an ethnic cleansing campaign? You already have these far-right ministers are actively asking for an ethnic cleansing, not only in Gaza Strip, but also in the West Bank. And if you do not combat them now, if you do not restrain them now, if the international community does not speak up now, then I fear the worst may come. So now's the time to act for Canadians, for the world.
Well, before I get to Canada, I'm going to say that it's not quite so black and white in terms of Israeli-Palestinian relations. For multiple reasons, in 1948, the guilt of Europeans, the failure of Europeans to want to admit Jews into Europe or North America, and for a bunch of other reasons, the United Nations created two states, partition. And one side accepted, and 5 Arab countries attacked Israel on the other side. So it's not clear what state would have been formed in 1948, but there would have been the possibility of an Arab state. And I don't think we can simply ignore that. I don't think we can ignore the 67 war. I don't think we can ignore the 73 war. And I don't think we can ignore the fact that Israelis that you mentioned, Yitzhak Rabin and others, with American help, I can understand what you're saying about America not being an honest broker now. But then, I think Bill Clinton was sincerely trying to make peace at the time. I'm not laying blame on either side, because there's plenty of stories about where the blame lies. But I think we can't lay all the blame on Israel for the failure. For the last 15 years, absolutely. I have no problem agreeing to that, and you're absolutely right. As regards what's going on right now in Gaza, first of all, I should say up front, irrespective of all of the violations against Palestinians and the occupation, the root causes that have to be addressed don't justify what happened on October 7th. It shouldn't happen to Israelis. It shouldn't happen to Palestinians. What's happening now shouldn't be happening to Palestinians. But what went on, the 1,400 people killed in the way they were killed, the hostages, not justified by 56 years of occupation. I'm not saying I don't understand where Palestinians are coming from, where the Palestinians who are not critical of this, and I know you don't support it, so I'm not suggesting you do. I just wanted to state that. The other thing is that Israel finds itself between a rock and a hard place. It was attacked. Israel has a right to self-defense, eliminating root causes, etc. It has a right to respond to those who attacked it. The problem with responding to those who attacked it is that those people, the political and the military leaders, are living in a very tiny urban area with 2.3 million other Palestinians, and they literally put their tunnels and themselves under hospitals, under schools, and they make it extremely difficult for Israel to go in and get them. And that's intentional. And if you wanted to avoid being caught and killed, it's a very smart thing to do, and having 212 or 10 or 8 hostages in front of you is equally smart. So Israel is faced with a population that is demanding a response. It is demanding their army, which failed them miserably, not only to protect them, but didn't show up for 6 to 12 hours. It's demanding that they do what they can to eliminate the political and the military threat that they just faced. And their view is, if we don't do it, then that's going to send a signal to Hamas and Hezbollah and to Iran that we are weak and that you just keep doing this, and eventually we're going to move out. Now, that's not going to happen, but that's not the signal that Israel wants to send. So what do they do? Impose a siege? Medieval. I can't figure it out. I can't believe that they imposed a siege. Collective punishment. Makes no sense to me. Makes no sense to me militarily, makes no sense to me politically. Horrible for their image. Horrible for the Palestinians. Suffering, no food, no water, no medicine. So, I don't support that. And I'm not a military person, and I don't know what their strategy is by bombing and killing and eventually going in. But I know what they want to do. I personally don't think that it's going to be successful, because they may kill 5,000 militants, 5,000 political leaders, 10,000, but they're radicalizing probably 300,000 young people. They're radicalizing people all over the world. Now, Israel is tired of protecting its image. It doesn't give a damn about its image anymore. It doesn't trust the UN, it doesn't trust the BBC, it doesn't trust the Secretary General, because what I'm saying to you is they feel they have a right to self-defense and they have to go do something, and the world says humanitarian crisis. Well, that's right. But the rules of war, humanitarian law, allows self-defense. It's the impossibility of their situation. How do they carry out self-defense and go after the people that just attacked them without massacring, killing, destroying thousands of the lives of children and women and innocent men, many of whom don't support Hamas. So, and then, you know, I'm not making excuses for Israelis, you know. I'm just telling you what the reality is. Now add into their equation 200 hostages. Forget about the fact that some of them are Canadian or American. They're Israelis. They're the people that survived the massacre. And now they've got to figure out what they're going to do and how they're going to do that. So, but in the meantime, thousands of Palestinians are being killed. So it's, I mean, it tears me apart. It tears, I think, all of us apart.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, when it comes to the... You mentioned that 70 years of occupation does not justify what Hamas did. Absolutely. But nor does what Hamas did justify 70 years of occupation. Nor does what Hamas did justify war crimes committed by Israel in Gaza as well. And if you're going to condemn one war crime, you have to condemn the other. You can't be a credible mediator or a credible voice unless you do so. This is not an equal battle. This is not an equal war. The power asymmetries. You have a power that has the capacity to wipe out the rest of Gaza. And I'll tell you, my family in Gaza has lost their homes in the airstrikes. They know every single person in their building, and not a single one of them was Hamas. Yet still they leveled their apartment building. The north of Gaza, 50% of all structures have been leveled to the ground. You might tell me 50% of all of northern Gaza is Hamas? This is not the case. This is indiscriminate targeting of civilians. And you know what? They told them to go to the south, and they're in the south now, 50 people in one room. They sleep standing if they sleep at all, because the bombings are constant. Even in the south, the bombings are happening every day. And I call them every day to check up. They say, we are without food, we are without water, but we are alive every day. And you know what's happening? I asked them, how are the airstrikes? Have they stopped bombing the south? They said no. And if it's 400 meters away, it's considered the far one. That is the bomb that's dropped on them. The bombings are constant. And if it's time to end this senseless bloodbath, a ceasefire now to allow humanitarian aid, a ceasefire now to end this violence, to push for peace, is not a luxury, it's a necessity. It's an ethical and moral duty and responsibility. And look, I understand the Israelis would wish to target Hamas now and dismantle the organization, as they would say. Well, let me tell you, I looked today, there was a nice article on Foreign Affairs this morning, which showed the poll of how many Palestinians in the Gaza Strip supported the two-state solution, and how many in the West Bank. And it showed that 50% of the Palestinians support a two-state solution, which is actually a remarkable thing, even in the Gaza Strip, which has been under siege for 16 years and has experienced 5 wars before then. But this war, and believe me this war will not decrease Hamas's support, it will increase it. And it will not dismantle Hamas, it will lead to a new cycle of violence. Because as the current rhetoric we see from the Israeli ministers, the dehumanizing rhetoric that we see, as soon as this ground invasion occurs, the brutality that will occur will be entirely predictable in its consequences.
Khalil, we're pushing for time. So.
Yes, yeah. So it's important to push for peace and push for a resolution to this conflict. And the attempt to create the Arab governments, for example, they have rejected the idea of Palestinians being pushed into the Sinai for a reason, because they know, as happened before when Israel ethnically cleansed 700,000, 60% of the Palestinian population in 1948, that those refugees became revolutionaries. They picked up arms, and it started from the refugee camps themselves. This isn't a solution. This would only continue and perpetuate the cycle of violence. You want to break that cycle, you have to push for a two-state solution. You need to act. And you have to be a neutral, honest broker. in this regard. Yes?
Maybe should we go to questions? I mean,
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we'll go to questions and then I'll just say one thing. Don't count on Canada to take a lead in this. I mean, Canada I'm just trying to be honest. Canada is not in a position to take the lead on something as major as this. And I wouldn't count on the Europeans either. Unfortunately or fortunately, I think you're going to have to count on the Americans, and one just has to hope that the Americans will try to resume a more honest broker position. I agree with you 100%. They'll never be fully honest, but they have their own interest in having peace in the Middle East. And let's hope that that own interest facilitates their acting on behalf of both sides. Go.
Question is, Israel is surrounded by hostile neighbors, which we all agree on. Is the hostility not due to Israel not allowing a true and just Palestinian state? Would not having a Palestinian state remove such hostility and allow Israel peace finally?
Would having a Palestinian
Yeah.
state.
Sorry, would
yeah.
not having a Palestinian state.
Well, I think they mean would having a Palestinian state remove the hostility.
Yes?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, I mean, I have to say that the Arab countries, the Gulf, have done virtually nothing for the Palestinians, except for Qatar, who's provided funds to Hamas. There's been a lot of rhetoric. Many ambassadors from the surrounding countries that I talk to would always tell me there'll never be peace in the Middle East until the Palestinian issue is solved. But they've never done anything to help the Palestinians. The Abraham Accords is an example, and so is the US-Saudi deal. I'm sorry. Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas. Having a Palestinian state is exactly what they don't want, because they want Israel out of there. They really do want Israel removed from the area. And I don't believe that they have the Palestinians' interests at heart at all. I mean, the Hamas, yes, Hezbollah, and Iran, no. Hezbollah is there essentially as funded and armed by Iran, and there as a deterrent against Israel in respect of Iran. That's why they're there, and that's why they're funded. And there is an analysis going on now that the reason that Hezbollah is unlikely to enter this is because Iran doesn't want to waste their deterrent on the Palestinians or on Hamas. Because if Hezbollah does enter the fray, there will be bombing again in South Beirut. There will be bombing in large parts of Lebanon. And Hezbollah, which has a political as well as a military role, will be in trouble. And they know that. So what their calculation is if they do decide to go in, I don't know. But once again, just the way the Palestinian people in Gaza are going to suffer, the Lebanese people who have been suffering, as we know, for the last 3-4 years and more will suffer if rockets rain down from Hezbollah. So there are a million reasons why the Palestinians deserve a state and should have a state. But it's not going to end Iran and Hezbollah's activities in the region.
Can I add to this as well? I mean, you mentioned the calculation here. the longer this war goes on, the more likely that it will escalate into a larger, more regional conflict. And this is because the longer it goes on, the more likely there will be an uprising in the West Bank. If this happens, Hezbollah will have an opportunity to strike at Israel at the same time, an unprecedented opportunity. So this is yet another reason to end the war as soon as possible. If you wish to prevent an escalation into a much wider regional war, which I think is the most important thing. And I think so far the Chinese have acted in this regard, because I know you mentioned that China has more to gain from this. I think it's not the case. They have the most to lose from a Middle East that is inflamed and engulfed in war, because 40% of all of their oil imports come from the Gulf. They have more to lose than anybody else, more than the Americans who are self-sufficient at the same time. And that's why they've been pushing for a ceasefire as soon as possible in the Security Council, which is being vetoed by the Americans. So it's important to recognize this, that the way to stop the potential of escalation is to push for a ceasefire and is to push for an end to this war.
Hamas is becoming more and more popular in the West Bank. Why is that?
Because they're seen as the defenders of the Palestinian people. Every time an Israeli minister goes up onto the Al-Aqsa mosque area, it's Hamas that stands up and protests. And because the Palestinian Authority is seen and perceived by many Palestinians as collaborators, because they are the enforcers in the West Bank against terrorism. In large parts of the West Bank, the PA is in control, and they assist Israel on a daily basis by preventing terrorism in Israel proper. And Bibi always refused to acknowledge it. He refused to give any credit to Abbas for those activities. So they're discredited, and Hamas is seen as defending the faith and defending the Palestinian people. And for many Palestinians, probably what happened on October 7th was seen as an example of that, as horrific as it was.
In the build-up to Oslo, the world asked the PLO to recognize Israel and condone violence in all its forms, condemn violence in all its forms. This was unpopular at the time, and since then Palestinians have lost more than ever. The question is, do you think Palestinians have lost faith in nonviolent solutions?
Well, I hope not, because they're dealing with a country that is much, much more powerful than them, and a country that's not going away. I have great sympathy for the Palestinians in the sense that we in the West say, don't use violence. And then when they want to go to the International Criminal Court, Canada and the United States and other Western countries veto it. And when they want to go to the International Court of Justice, Canada and the United States and other Western countries say no. And when they want to use BDS sanctions, the same that we used against South Africa, we in the West say, oh, no, no. I mean, I'm not a great supporter of parts of BDS because it ends up meaning that progressive Israelis who are fighting for a two-state solution can't go speak in the United States. But too bad, really, too bad. So if you're not going to give the Palestinians nonviolent means to protest, what do you expect them to do? But unfortunately, violence is not going to solve their problem, and it's not going to solve the problems in the Middle East. So, unfortunately, we've got to wait for other solutions.
Can I also add on this?
Yes, please.
When it comes to this, the reason why, And you know, when I mentioned the statistic of how many Palestinians support a two-state solution, it's higher in the Gaza Strip than it is in the West Bank for one reason. It's because people in the West Bank have become disillusioned with the idea of negotiations and peace process when settlements continue to encroach upon their land, when settlers are constantly committing violence and killing Palestinians. This is the reason they have become disillusioned with it. And they have become disillusioned with the idea that the Palestinian Authority has renounced the use of violence, renounced the use of terrorism, and pushed for these negotiations. And all it's gotten in return is more and more settlers and more settler violence against them. So they see that in the Gaza Strip, there is no settler violence. And they have increasingly come to say, okay, well, we need to go back to the armed struggle if this is the case. Now, I personally believe that the path of civil disobedience is more applicable in the case of Palestine, and it has brought down the British Empire in India, it has brought down the apartheid South African government, it has brought down the Jim Crow laws in the United States. It can work through this way too, of course, but you cannot blame Palestinians who wish to go back to the armed struggle, because the armed struggle eventually in the past did bring us to the negotiations and did bring us to the table for talks. So this is the main reason that the West Bank has more support for Hamas than the Gaza Strip.
But violence in the Second Intifada did also end the peace process.
This is true, yeah.
So
This is also what I wanted to add myself, being a child in that particular intifada in Jerusalem.
please.
No, please continue. It's just, I don't think it can present it in a clear-cut way.
Yeah, I mean, for many Israelis, the Second Intifada, which started, well, after the assassination of Rabin, but was prompted by the fact that the peace process, which they had hoped would lead to a state, stalled, and because settlement expansion continued. But the Second Intifada turned Israelis far to the right, and then Bibi just continued the process. And that's really what we have to turn back. And we have to hope that what Hamas just did doesn't turn them farther to the right. Sorry, Michael.
No, not at all. The questioner asks states, America and the West have had the power to restrain Israel and ensure a two-state solution all along. Why have they not done so?
Well, I don't know if they could ensure a two-state solution. I don't know if they could force Israel, but they could certainly put a lot more pressure on Israel than they have. No question about it, and no question that they should have. Canada has on its website, Foreign Affairs, settlements are illegal, occupation is bad, two-state solution is good. When was the last time you heard our Prime Minister stand up and unequivocally demand for a action toward a two-state solution? When was the last time we criticized settlement expansion? I mean, we sort of criticized the current coalition's efforts at radical judicial reform, but the West has settlements expand and one or two countries say something. I mean, that is the key signal that you are not interested in peace. You're sitting across from somebody and you're sharing a pizza and you're talking peace, and every 5 minutes one side grabs a piece of your pizza and you say, are you really talking about sharing this pizza, or are you really interested in annexing the West Bank? And that's what's been going on. And nobody has done what this questioner is asking. Stand up and say, enough is enough. No more $3 billion a year in aid to you. no more nice guy, Israel our best friend. I mean, Israel is a strong, independent, tough country. And they can say no to countries demanding that they do something, but countries should be doing it, in my view. They have to, and now why aren't they doing it? Well, I mean, that goes back to the Holocaust, that goes back to Israel as the David, as it was. I mean, it was the David, it was attacked, it has been attacked, it has tried for peace, but that's no longer the Israel that I grew up with and that existed pre-Bibi. And so the West has to get over its guilt, and it has to accept that there's a new reality there. And in that new reality, Israel, right-wing governments, are the oppressors. And they should be responded to in, with a little bit of muscle, if they're interested in achieving peace, because otherwise there's no interest for Israel. Israel has to make a calculation, and it has made the calculation. Most Israelis never go to the West Bank. They can't go to Gaza. They don't see the treatment of Palestinians every day at the checkpoints. They don't see the settlers. My wife and I went on a tour of Hebron and watched settlers throw stones at Palestinian kids coming out of school on a morning, and have the IDF basically criticize us. I was an ambassador. The IDF basically shouting at us. The indignities that Palestinians live every day in the West Bank is their reality. And Israelis don't see it, so for them, I mean, look at the stats. In the OECD, Israel is like doing unbelievably. GDP, high, unemployment, low, restaurants, cultural activities. You go to Tel Aviv, I mean, it's New York plus. So what's the push? Why should Israelis make peace with the Palestinians and then have a terrorist state on its border? The calculation has to stop. That calculation, Israel has to realize that going forward, the existential threat is not Iran. The existential threat is not Hezbollah. Hundreds of IDF ex-chiefs of staff, Mossad heads of the Shin Bet, all agree. You can see it. Tzipi Livni says it, former foreign minister. Ehud Barak says it. Ehud Olmert says it. The existential threat to Israel is the threat from within. It's the Palestinians on your border. They're not going to be occupied for another 50 years. That's your existential threat. Deal with it. But most Israelis don't get it because life is too good. And
Can I ask a quick question? Since the United States was brought up, the United States has tended to, each president during my lifetime at least, has tended to look at the situation in terms of a global problem. It's a macro problem. How does this issue fit into the wider globe that the United States has to oversee? And you have just spoken, Ambassador, of the problem of the problem within a very internal and, if you will, localized setting. And I'm not sure, I was thinking back to your mention of Bill Clinton, who I think very earnestly made a lot of effort and was very upset when it did not work out. I think that it really was looked at as a macro issue and not as a micro issue. And I'm wondering if you could comment on that actually very quickly. I know we're running out of time, but...
Well, it's both a macro and a micro issue.
Certainly it is.
We've just seen the micro issues become a macro issue.
Right.
And as Khalil has said, it could end up as a regional conflict.
Exactly.
And so the United States, for humanitarian reasons, for regional reasons, and for global reasons, should be moving this forward. Did you want to say something?
I would just like to add
Yeah.
one thing to what you said.
Sure.
Agreeing with the fact that the occupation should end, it will not solve what had happened on October 7th. These are two separate things, and I think it's important to make that clear. When Israel went into the wars, in particular of this 67 war, in the end of that, there were borders. The border with the Gaza Strip is the same border that it has been. It has not been disputed. And so it's, I think, not true to think that if Israel decided or was pushed to a two-state solution and ends the occupation, all of its neighbors will suddenly be accepting of it. The ideological issue, the underlying ideological issue, is that they do not accept this country in the region.
Yes, but the PLO and the PA have accepted Israel in the region. They've stated that
Hamas hasn't.
Hamas hasn't, and that's why Israel is trying right now to do away with Hamas. Hamas's charter says Israel should be destroyed. But you can't allow extremists like Hamas on the one hand and Ben-Gvir and Smotrich on the other to run your policy. That's what happened when Rabin was killed.
Yep.
They were going down a path, and the extremists said, we don't like this, so we're going to kill Rabin. The Egyptians were going to kill Sadat, and Hamas just did what the
What it
same
said it would
thing.
do.
What it said it would do, but it was trying to derail any efforts at reconciliation, in this case between the Saudis and Israel and the US, but also they will do everything possible to ensure that the two-state solution doesn't happen.
And that is why the second half of this issue is not, I think, trying to find a solution in the Americans or the Canadians or the Europeans imposing this on Israel, but rather that the people themselves on both sides have to believe that this is the solution.
You're absolutely right. Aaron Miller says that nobody's ever washed a rent-a-car because they don't own the car. And this will never end until Israel and the Palestinians want it to end. But I'm convinced that Israel has to be pushed because their political calculation will, if they aren't pushed, their political calculation will be, we're better off with what we've got now until it becomes clear that two states is the way to go. And what really worries me, as a Jew who has a sister that lives in Israel, is that that is the existential threat. That at some point, all of your neighbors are going to rise up. And the insecurity that Israelis feel today, this incredible insecurity that they feel today, which they haven't felt for quite a while, is only going to be magnified. So, I may be wrong. I'm just not sure Israel wants to go there by itself, and I'm not sure they've got a government. Well, we know what their
The current
government
government,
is now,
we
for
do agree
sure.
about that.
We agree about that.
Yes.
But I understand where you're coming from, and you're sort of 80% right from my perspective.
Folks, our wonderful Massey gatekeeper, Alyssa Ginsburg, has said we're out of time. And I'm sorry for those of you who didn't get your questions asked. You may try to grab John as he's heading speedily for the door,
Or any of our other
or any of the other panelists. Our three panelists have done a wonderful job. Anne-Marie, Lior, Khalil. And I want to thank the three of you for your contribution.
Thank you for organizing this. Really great.
Thank you. And you, my friend, have been spectacular. And so if we can give everyone a round of applause.
Good job. Thanks for organizing.
You said don't hold your breath.